Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and I am joined today by writer William Duguid. Say hello.
Hello. Good to be back with you, Patrick.
Nice to see you again. For our first story, we've got a Ukraine update, day 721 of a conflict. Russian bombing raids killed three people, including a child, late on Tuesday near Ukraine's eastern city of Donetsk. The local council said. It reported that the strikes hit 9 apartment blocks and a hospital in Selidov, about 20 kilometers west of the front line. 12 people were also reported injured, including 4 children. Russian state news said Ukraine launched 9 drones over Russia's Belgorod and Voronezh regions, as well as over the Black Sea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has welcomed the U.S. Senate vote that approved $61 billion in aid for Ukraine and sent it to the House of Representatives for a vote. The Democratic Majority Leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, said he was confident in the bill, also providing assistance to Israel and other allies, would pass the House with support from both Republicans and Democrats if there were a vote, and called on House leaders to do the right thing. House Speaker Mike Johnson asked if he planned to put the bill forward to a vote, and he said, "I certainly don't," and suggested members were busy with other matters. But Republicans and Democrats in favor of supporting Ukraine are likely to force a vote using a process called a discharge petition. Russian forces blasted 8 settlements and areas of Ukraine's Sumy region 331 times on Tuesday, local officials said. Explosions were caused by mortars, artillery, a tank, kamikaze drones, and other munitions. The communities that reportedly came under fire included Kotinsk, Yunakivsk, Bilopolsk, Krasnyopilsk, as well as Miropolisk, Velikopsarivsk, Shaliginsk, Serodinubidsk, and that was all. There are no reports of casualties. Sanctions against Russia are having an effect, but need to be broadened and more strictly enforced, according to Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former NATO Secretary General. Rasmussen writes in the Financial Times, "Victory will depend largely on whether Ukraine and its allies can outproduce Russia. We must realign our sanctions policy with this objective. We should recognize that although the measures will not force Moscow to end the war overnight, they are another tool to disrupt and degrade the country's means of production. Every Russian tank we prevent from being built is one less the Ukrainian forces need to destroy." UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron will urge allies to increase defense productions to help Ukraine, his office said ahead of a diplomatic tour to Bulgaria, Poland, and Germany. Russia's parliamentary speaker has said it will vote on the 21st of February on suspending its participation in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation, the OSCE. The organization has 57 members, including Russia and Ukraine. Russia is preparing for military confrontation with the West within the next decade and could be deterred by a counter buildup of armed forces, Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service has said. Russia has lost more than 3,000 tanks during its invasion of Ukraine, the equivalent of its entire pre-war active inventory, but has enough lower quality armored vehicles in storage for years of replacements. William, passing over to you. What do you think of a comment made by Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service there, talking about Russia preparing for conflict with the West?
Um, it's certainly a concern. We don't know what Russia's intentions are. And in fact, the amount of dialogue we're having with Russia is going backwards because, as you also read, on the 21st of February, the Russian Duma will be looking at a proposal to withdraw from the Organization for Security and Cooperation, which is the successor to a pre-Cold War or a Cold War era body through which the Soviets and the West did maintain some channels. And if that withdrawal happens, that reduces the amount of dialogue we've got, and that can't be a good thing. It's actually just impossible to tell, in other regards, what Russia's intentions are and whether Russia has anything at this stage to benefit from conflict with the West. It could also be seen as a reaction, of course, to NATO build-ups and to proposals to send Ukraine money. So it could be part of the general saber rattling. So, yeah, the short answer is I don't know, but everything at this stage, with nearly 2 years into this war, sounds pretty ominous.
Um, do you think Do you think there is still cause for concern of Russia wanting to potentially wage this great war versus the West, considering that when its assault on Ukraine was beginning, we were considering a far swifter action and a far swifter conflict. You know, many people were predicting Kiev being taken in weeks, and yet this doesn't seem to have manifested. Does Russia pose this threat that we seem to have believed in the past and maybe sometimes talk about now?
I think anything that Russia tried would be incremental and would be sort of the thing that would go on for a little while. I think they do have resource issues because, as we've seen, they've lost just in the Ukraine war the equivalent of their pre-war stock of tanks, and now they've got much older things. But there is also in the background, in the global player background, what is China thinking about everything, and when does China make a move to take this on to some other level? China will have a say in the end. It's remaining in the background, but this is a geopolitical global issue, and I don't. China will work on basically what is for its own benefit, but it's hard at this stage to see how China would necessarily benefit from a prolonged conflict between Russia and the West. So I think probably the risk isn't as large as all that. But in an increasingly uncertain world, and with nuclear weapons always around there and saber rattling talk, you never quite know.
Thank you. Moving into our next story, we have the updates from Israel and Gaza. At least 28,576 Palestinians have been killed and 68,291 have been injured in Israeli strikes on Gaza since the 7th of October, with 103 Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes and 145 injured in just the past 24 hours, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Martin Griffiths, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, has warned military operations in Rafah could lead to a slaughter in Gaza and a humanitarian operation at death's door. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has said that he is alarmed by what is reportedly happening at Nasser Medical Complex in Gaza. Nasser is the backbone of a health system in southern Gaza. It must be protected. Humanitarian access must be allowed, he said. Nasser Hospital and the surrounding area has turned into a battle zone, according to Al Jazeera journalist Hani Mahmoud in Rafah. Medicines Sans Frontieres project coordinator in Gaza, Lisa Machiner, said there's sometimes even no space to walk in Rafah. The World Health Organization, WHO, said today that Gaza's hospitals are completely overwhelmed and accused Israel of impeding its aid delivery missions to Gaza. Israeli intelligence chief David Barnea told CIA Director William Burns in Cairo on Tuesday met CIA. Sorry. Israeli intelligence chief David Barnea met CIA Director William Burns in Cairo on Tuesday for talks on a Qatari brokered plan to halt fighting in Gaza. The negotiations, which also involved Qatar's prime minister and Egyptian officials, are part of an intensifying effort to secure a ceasefire before Israel proceeds with a ground incursion into the southern city of Rafah, where more than half of the territory's population has fled. A Hamas source told news agency France Presse (AFP) that that a delegation was heading to Cairo to meet Egyptian and Qatari mediators after Israeli negotiators held talks with mediators on Tuesday. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has also was also due in Cairo today for talks with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, says AFP. Ireland and Spain's prime ministers have written and implored EU chiefs to take action over the deteriorating conditions in Gaza a day after the Tausig claimed Israel had become blinded by rage in a highly unusual move. Leo Varadkar and Pedro Sanchez wrote to the European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen of the previous matter. They asked the Commission to urgently review whether Israel is complying with its obligations to respect human rights in Gaza. Israeli airstrikes have been reported across Gaza, including in the southern part of the Strip, by Al Jazeera's correspondents. About 100 representatives of hostages flew to The Hague on Wednesday to file a crimes against humanity complaint at the International Criminal Court, ICC, against Hamas, reports the AFP. An Israeli woman was killed and 8 of her injured in a suspected Hezbollah attack, according to Israeli military and medical officials. Reported the Times of Israel. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was deeply troubled by the number of journalists killed in the Gaza conflict. At least 18 Palestinians were arrested overnight in the occupied West Bank, including 2 women from Jericho, according to Al Jazeera. The SNP will table a motion for a fresh vote in an immediate ceasefire in Gaza when MPs return to Westminster next week, amid a growing global outcry over the deaths of more than 28,000 Palestinian children and civilians. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn, MP, will conclude the debate. It will be the first opportunity for MPs to vote for an immediate ceasefire since the SNP tabled a similar motion in November. William, do you think that we're on a sort of maybe precipice in regards to Israel's treatment of Palestine, with global pressure mounting, I would argue, potentially day by day?
Well, certainly global pressure is mounting, and we've just had the intervention from the Irish and Spanish leaders. David Cameron, I think, is making extremely uncomfortable noises about how things are going and what the outcome of a Rafah incursion would be. But all of these things are still talking around the margins. I really don't know, when we talk about how much pressure is being mounted on Israel not to do this, how much effect that's actually having, because things seem to proceed no matter what. And you get things like, just weeks ago, the International Court of Justice was talking about the necessity for aid to be delivered. And now, far from aid being delivered, we're hearing about deliveries being held up by Israeli inspections or other excuses. And this is all part of the general charges of genocide that are being raised against Israel, that they do not let aid in, they do not let up in the attacking, and the death toll continues to increase almost no matter what. So I think the international pressure is going to have to get a lot stronger for it to be a true precipice. And I also think the US, which is a major player in this discussion, is going to have to get a lot tougher. And whether that's entirely electorally comfortable for the president, I don't know. But I think that is the only thing that is going to hold Israel back from what I think would indeed be a very, very damaging slaughter in Rafah, where we've reached the point where literally there is nowhere else to go.
Yeah, I think there's an argument that the pressure is different now. I think, especially this ground invasion of Rafah seems to maybe be posing a breaking point with leaked conversations from the US demonstrating maybe very, very stern words being targeted towards Netanyahu and the Israeli government. And just in general, I think with the electorate as well, the concept of telling a bunch of civilians to flee into a specific area and then later ground invading it seems like it could pose a really severe breaking point for the situation. Would you agree?
It it could do, but we've been here before and many other things that have looked like breaking points. And if the electorate to which you refer is in fact the Israeli electorate, I don't know. I mean, it is true that Benjamin Netanyahu has an incentive to continue as he's doing, because the minute the war stops or there's an extended ceasefire, he's in political trouble. And I do think, despite the crimes of humanity charge against Hamas, I think a lot of the hostage families must deep down be thinking that even if they did manage to free a couple of hostages earlier in the week, this sort of onslaught is not the way to free hostages. And if anything, it's more likely to kill them or injure them than anything else. So there could be pressure from all sorts of areas, but as I say, we've been here before, and I mean, it would be lovely if it were to stop, but it just seems to grind on nevertheless.
Thank you so much. For our next story, we'll be looking into the UK inflation rate. The UK's annual inflation rate remained at 4% in January, despite rising energy bills adding to the pressures on households. Figures from the Office of National Statistics, ONS, showed inflation as measured by the Consumer Prices Index defied predictions of an increase in January. After the first monthly fall in food prices for more than 2 years offset the rise in gas and electricity costs. The Bank of England had predicted a small rise in inflation last month after an increase in the Ofgem energy price cap for households across Great Britain, while economists polled by Reuters expected an increase of 4.2%. However, food and non-alcoholic drink prices fell at a monthly rate of 0.4% in January, the first monthly decline since May 2021, driven by price cuts in January for bread and cereals, cream crackers, sponge cakes, and chocolate biscuits. Although inflation has fallen back from the levels seen a year ago, prices for essential goods and services remain high, adding a pressure on households amid the cost of the living crisis. The ONS said that although food inflation fell on the in January, prices had increased by 25% over the past 2 years, more than double the rate seen over the entire preceding decade. Commenting, SNP economy spokesperson Drew Hendry MP said, "While there has been no rise in inflation, basics such as mortgages, rent, food prices, and energy bills will remain stubbornly high for some time. Temperatures are still very low across much of Scotland, especially in my constituency and across the Highlands, meaning many will still be facing the difficult choice between heating their homes and spending money on basics like food. People in Scotland shouldn't be paying the price for the economic incompetence of a Tory Westminster government we didn't vote for." William, to your understanding, how are these ebbs and flows and inflation impacting the average person? And with wage growth on the rise, is inflation something that like the average person is still concerned about?
I think inflation has been very damaging to the average person. Wage increases have been a little bit spotty. They've been better in the private sector than in the public sector. And prices are still going up, and they're going up at a fairly frightening rate if you look at it over the 2 years. And that inevitably causes problems for people. There is going to be, of course, in April, an increase in the national minimum wage, which will go up 10%, because it does follow inflation. Now, whether or not that itself fuels inflation, there is a debate amongst economists, but at least it will ease the pressure at that point. And what will also ease the pressure, I hope, is that energy prices are predicted to come down in April also, when that quarter comes in. And That plus the gradually warming temperatures just in the natural course of things may help. But it's not an easy time for people on average income, and both of these things could be affected by world events, which are fairly volatile at the moment. And there are restrictions on trade because of them, and there are possible volatility in utility prices in the future. So it could be what they call events, dear boy, that causes this to be less of a sort of period when people can relax a wee bit, and possibly more trouble in future.
Thank you so much. For our next story, polls are showing that the Labour Party's lead falls to lowest since June 2023. Labour's lead over the Conservatives has fallen by 7 percentage points to its lowest since June 2023, according to a Savanta poll published today. Polls over the past years have consistently shown Labour ahead in this year's election after 14 years of Conservative government. The drop in support should be a concern to Labour supporters, coming after Sir Keir Starmer scrapped his 23 £8 billion green spending target and the party finding itself once more embroiled in allegations with anti-Semitism. The latest poll, conducted between February 9th and February 11th, estimates that Labour should take 41% of the vote, down 5 points from 2 weeks ago before. Support for the Conservatives rose by 2 points to 29% in the same period. The results are based on online interviews with 2,224 people. The last time Savanta's polling showed Labour's vote share as low as 41% was in September 2022, and the party's lead, as low as 12%, was in June last year. It has also emerged today that Rachel Reeves accepted £10,100 from a climate skeptic, Labour Lord, just days before Labour abandoned the flagship £23 billion green energy spending pledge. According to media reports, Lord Bernard after they abandoned the flagship £28 billion green energy spending pledge. According to media reports, Lord Bernard de Nogue, who has previously told Parliament that the climate change debate suffers from scaremongering and exaggeration. That's Lord Bernard de Montague. Lord Bernard Donahue told Parliament that the issue of climate change debate suffers from scaremongering and exaggeration. He then went on to donate to the Shadow Chancellor's office late last month. In Scotland, a new poll shows the support for the SNP is holding up as they seem set to emerge from the largest party with 40 MPs, while the Conservatives face wipeout at the next general election. The Daily Mirror poll, carried out by Find Out Now and Electoral Calculus, predicts Scottish Labour could win 13 seats, and the Liberal Democrats are predicted to keep 4. William, for the UK general elections, how much does the landscape change if the Conservatives start making headway on their immigration programs? For example, if they start getting their Rwanda planes out.
That's an interesting one. I think very often the seeds of an election defeat are laid well in advance, and any headway that you might make in the last little while on any area is not going to perhaps shift things too much. But it remains a very difficult situation to predict. Labour does keep its lead. It's still 12%, but it has shrunk, and Labour seems to have lost a wee bit of direction, and that could affect things. One thinks back to 1992, where Labour did go into an election with a lead and almost seemed to celebrate their victory before the vote had taken place. And then there was quite a turnaround on election day. And I think some people in the Labour Party must be a little bit nervous about that. The Tories, meanwhile, have nothing particular to lose, so they can throw anything they like at this election. Whether they will get the Rwanda programme underway before the election is And of course, in Rishi Sunak's case, it's even something he laid a wee bet with Piers Morgan on. But with nothing to lose, that makes them dangerous. It really does. And the electorate is so cheesed off with politicians in general that there are questions about turnout as well. So it remains, like so much in today's bulletin, very, very hard to predict. I would be worried, though, if I were Labour, because this poll only just touches on the problems they've had with Azhar Ali being displaced as the candidate for Rochdale. His displacement had not taken place, but there was talk in the Mail on Sunday about what his remarks had been. That was just the start of that, and so they're yet to feel the full event of it. The full outcome of it.
Mm.
They're certainly feeling the blowback from the 28 billion green investment. But this latest story involving Rachel Reeves won't have touched the polls yet, and we'll probably have to wait another week to see what that does.
Thank you so much. For our next story, the NATO chief rebukes Donald Trump as NATO announces record defense spending. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, has accused Donald Trump of undermining the basis of a transatlantic alliance as he announced that 18 NATO members were expected to beat the target of spending more than 2% of GDP on defense. That was the statement from Donald Trump. It was the second rebuke by the NATO chief to the Republican frontrunner in less than a week, reinforced by a declaration that Germany was among the countries planning to spend over the threshold for the first time in a generation. We should not undermine the credibility of NATO's deterrence, said Stoltenberg today as he responded to comments made by Trump at a campaign rally at the weekend. Deterrence is in the mind of our adversaries, he added. On Saturday, Trump caused outrage in Europe when he said he would not protect any NATO member that had failed to meet the 2% target, and added that he would even encourage Russia to continue attacking them. A day later, Stoltenberg said Trump's rhetoric puts American and European soldiers at increased risk. While today, after a meeting of defense ministers, the normally diplomatic Secretary General returned to the theme, arguing, "We should leave no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding in Moscow." German officials added that Berlin would allocate more than 2% of GDP to defense during 2024, and the news agency DPA later said that would amount to 68.58 billion euros, or 2.01% of GDP in Germany. It will be the first time military spending has exceeded the threshold since the end of the Cold War. A year ago, the proportion was 1.57%. Germany has long been one of NATO's lowest military spenders, reflecting a long-held caution in the light of its role in the Second World War, and as a result has become an implicit target of complaints from Trump and other American leaders, who have argued that Washington takes on much of a financial burden of protecting Europe. Germany's attitude has dramatically changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, described by the Chancellor Olaf Scholz as a time-turning moment. If sustained, it could lead to Germany overtaking the UK and France, traditionally Europe's largest military spenders. Across the 31-country alliance, Stoltenberg said he expected 18 allies to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, which he said was a dramatic change. That is another record number, and a six-fold increase from 2014, when only 3 allies met the target. Now, William, we kind of mentioned it there a little bit, but Trump has long-running rhetoric in this field of demanding other NATO allies to contribute more and do more for defense spending. Will this be seen as like a big win for Trump voters and for Trump fans, I suppose?
Trump will try to present it as a big win if people start making that connection. I think the truth is that the Ukraine situation is what has led to countries, and possibly 18 of them, revising their opinion about how much money they should be contributing to NATO right now. So, however much Trump wishes to picture it, I think that's the reality. Um, you would almost think that if Trump were president and looking at it right now, he'd have nothing much to worry about. But I think there will always be little things Trump says, perhaps more for the US electorate than for anybody else's ears. It was actually quite irresponsible um, when he got to almost encouraging Russia to attack anybody who did not fulfill his view of what should be paid to NATO. But we do need the Americans to be fully engaged with NATO if NATO is going to do anything. I think Stoltenberg has also been saying that um, the EU on its own can't defend Europe, which is a fairly frightening statement to be making, but nevertheless does have a point. I mean, a lot of it does depend on our earlier discussion about what Putin's long term intentions may be. But certainly, if NATO is to be a proper defensive alliance, whatever the European members put into it, the US has to be solidly behind it and certainly not making statements about undermining it, whether it's for electoral gain or whether it's actually meant.
Thank you so much. Continuing this focus on America, Tom Suzy wins wins the New York election for a seat vacated by George Santos. The Democrat Tom Suzy has won the New York congressional seat vacated by the disgraced Republican George Santos on Tuesday night, in a boost for Joe Biden ahead of the presidential election. The victory narrows the slim Republican majority in the House and gives Democrats a much-needed win in New York City's Long Island suburbs, where Republican candidates have shown strength in recent elections. Associated Press called the result after 52% of votes were counted, with Suzy garnering 59% compared to 41% for Republican candidate Massey Phillips. Later in the evening, with 93% of the votes tallied, Suzy led Phillip 53.9% over 46.1%. The people of Queens and Long Island are sick and tired of political bickering, Suzy said during a victory speech. They want us to come together and solve problems. The seat in Long Island was seen as a key indicator of voter sentiment before the expected Biden-Donald Trump election in November. Biden won the district in 2020, but the area swung Republican in 2022 midterm elections, when Santos was elected. After the results came in, the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, now one seat closer to flipping Congress to Democratic control, said that extreme MAGA Republicans had spent millions attacking Tom personally and distorting his distinguished public service record. The size of the margin of Suzy's victory, after polling only showed a slim lead, will be a cause of worry for Republicans in the upcoming presidential election. I think it's easy right now with Republican primaries going on to sort of get a distorted view of the strength of like a single candidate. Obviously, with primaries, it's just been Trump winning and Trump winning and Trump winning. How much insight can we really garner from what is probably still like a pretty close win between the Democrats and Republicans in Long Island? How much of a representation of like the rest of the mood about Trump versus Biden does this represent?
I think it's very, we shouldn't really read too much into the result. Um, there might have been special circumstances. I'm not entirely sure that the relatively inexperienced Republican candidate chose the best strategy, first and foremost. Indeed, Trump, in his way, has almost disowned her in some of his remarks about um, um, one of the things, strangely, about actually being a registered Democrat. I will never understand how American politics works in that regard. But Trump was very dismissive, and it's not entirely without a point. Although I don't think it's a great characteristic of him to be so dismissive. Also, there were weather conditions that may have affected turnout, and there's a long way to go before we get to November. But it does make things much more interesting in the Congress, where the Republicans are now down to a 219, 213 lead, and that may have an impact on just what they can push through between now and November. And so in that sense, it's significant. But in predictive terms, I think we're a long way from seeing what the real pattern of things is. And the whole thing remains, to my mind, very unpredictable because looking at the relative ages or the absolute ages of the two candidates, literally anything can happen between now and November that will completely turn this whole situation on its head.
Thank you so much. The U.S. House votes to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas, President Biden's Secretary of Homeland Security, on explicitly political charges related to conditions of a southern border as Republicans attempt to capitalize on the issue in an election year. In a tight evening roll call vote, House Speaker Mike Johnson's thin Republican majority faced staunch Democratic opposition as the House voted 214 to 213 to impeach Mayorkas, who has become the first cabinet secretary to face charges in nearly 150 years. 3 Republicans voted against party lines: Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, Ken Buck from Colorado, and Tom McClintock from California, who said that the Mayorkas impeachment did not meet the bar laid out in the Constitution. After the vote, President Biden said in the statement, "History will not look kindly on House Republicans for their blatant act of unconstitutional partisanship and that has targeted an honorable public servant in order to play petty political games." Last weekend, Mayorkas told NBC that Republicans' allegations against him were baseless, and that's why I'm not really distracted by them. Mayorkas is also not the only Biden administration official the House Republicans wish to impeach. Republicans have filed legislation to impeach a long list, including Kamala Harris, the Vice President, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, Christopher Wray, the FBI Director, and Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary. However, those attempts are far from coming to fruition, unlike the situation with Mayorkas. I'm very sorry. Oh. William, I had a question for this, and that cough made me almost completely forget it.
Is this significant? Would that be the question or something
We
like?
can start with that, and if I think of something more clever, I'll ask you during.
All right. I think this was their second attempt within about a week to impeach Mayorkas. The first one narrowly failed, and this speaks to the sort of level of the majority that the Republicans have got. It's wafer thin, and if you've got people who are sick, then you might have a problem getting your thing through. And I think also the Democrats did manage to literally to wheel in somebody who was fairly sick but was not expected to appear, who took part in last week's vote. This week, the Representative Steve Scalise has come back, and that seems to have been part of what swung the vote this time. So that does speak to the level of interest one has in the makeup of the House as various elections go on, such as we've just discussed. As to whether it's significant, I don't think it will be. There will be a trial in 2 weeks, I think, after a recess. But the system demands that there's a 2/3 majority in favour of impeachment if it's going to happen. I don't see that happening with the numbers being as close as they are. So Mr. Mayorkas's removal from office is very unlikely, and the same is true of the rest of the Republican hit list if they ever get round to that. So I think this is mostly about optics. It's mostly about trying to paint the Biden administration as riven by incompetence and corruption, which is, I think, what any party aspiring to win a presidential election for its candidate in a few months would be doing, but nothing more significant than that.
Yeah, I suppose on that note, talk to me about the validity of blaming Mayorgas for the failure in border security, especially with the recent border security bill being rejected primarily by Republicans, which ties a little bit into the previous story because Tom Suzy worked on that bill and he's known for being a little bit more concerned about border security himself, representing that a bit harder on the Democrat side than usual. How valid is it for the Republicans to be chasing after Mayorkas for the issue of border security like this?
I think there's a constitutional bar on what you can impeach people for, and it's generally high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's very hard, in my view, to make the case that any alleged failings that he may have had with regard to border security get to that level. And it is significant, and he would certainly make the case that it's actually down to the failings of Congress to pass the necessary legislation um, to bring about the result that they're looking for. So I can see why certain Republicans were not too happy. And I really don't think it's a valid charge at all. I think it is politically motivated. And as I said, it's to create an impression, a general pattern of this is what the Biden administration is like, and probably very little more than that.
Thank you. Moving on for our next story, we're back in the UK with 40,000 new businesses set up in Scotland in 2023. The latest figures show that Scotland is experiencing a startup boom with over 40,000 new businesses set up in 2023. The figure is up 12% in 2022, making Scotland the fastest growing region in the UK, behind only London and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, unlike Scotland, are significantly benefiting from their access to the European single market. Data from Bayhurst and the Royal Bank of Scotland's Startup Index has also showed that across the UK, a record number of new businesses were set up by females in 2023. Former business owners and SNP MSP Ivan McKee welcomed these figures and highlighted the important contributions business make to our economy. SNP MSP Ivan McKee said, businesses, especially small businesses, play a vital role in supporting our local economies and powering growth in Scotland. Figures showing that a record number of businesses were set up during 2023 are very welcome and highlight the confidence people have in the SNP government's handling of Scotland's economy. William, now actually, this is something I didn't check before. Does the Scottish government, or like Scotland in general, have any movements to inspire women-led businesses individually? Because I know that such a program exists in the UK as a whole. Does that exist in Scotland at all?
um, Women-led businesses. I believe it does, but I can't tell you any details,
That's
except
fine.
that
That's sorry. That's just
it would
something that
be
popped into
very
mind.
likely to reflect the UK's view on that, because particularly with Nicola Sturgeon's influence over the last few years up till this time last year, I would be amazed if that were not so.
I think so. I guess you can just go with a more general statement because that's just something that popped randomly. I'm very sorry. What do you think of a story as a whole?
I think of the story as a whole, and it demonstrates. I mean, political parties can put it down to what they like about their handling of the economy, limited in scope as it is by the devolution settlement. But what it does say for me is that Scotland is and remains one of the more robust parts of the UK economy. If you were to look at the relative economic strength of the various areas of the UK economy, Scotland would invariably come in third or fourth, typically behind London and the southeast, and perhaps the Midlands. In this particular case, the opening of new businesses, which is one facet of it, then Northern Ireland does come in because it's got the Brexit advantages, as you say. But I think the health of any economy, even in the teeth of difficult economic times, is if businesses fail elsewhere, what's coming along to replace them? And this gives me a wee bit of heart that businesses are being replaced. I mean, there are particular sectors that seem to be doing particularly well in this regard. Property letting is one of them. Um, I believe retail is another strong one, which speaks fairly well about how people are getting on in spending money in the economy despite everything else, and takeaway restaurants and things, which means that is a sector where there's really quite a lot of turnover, but it's good to see new businesses coming in. So it makes me quite optimistic when people say to independent supporters, "You'll not be able to make it. You won't be able to function. Your businesses will all fail." I don't think that's right. I think actually, if you were to take Scotland in isolation, it's a pretty robust part of the whole picture, and this just bears that out.
Thank you so much, William. Our next story is the Scottish Government funding for sustainable agriculture. More than £7 million has been awarded to 517 rural businesses in 2023 from the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, AECS. Overall, £27 million will be paid over the lifetime of the contracts to applicants to help support land management activities that will benefit nature and mitigate against climate change. Farmers can now apply for the 2024-2025 AECS funding round with an expanded range of options to support biodiversity and climate-friendly farming activities and land management practices. More than £4 million will also be made available to fund slurry storage and irrigation lagoons in order to improve water quality in rural areas. Farmers and land managers can now apply for larger funding grants with an additional uplift available to those based in the island communities. This will be the final year that the support will be available for slurry storage. Examples of the activities of the AECS support include helping agricultural businesses convert to organic farming practices, creation and maintenance of habitats for specific species such as corn crakes, corn buntings, and waders, improving habitat variety, creation and restoration of hedgerows, control of invasive non-relative species. The Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Goujon said, AECS remains a key part of support for farmers, crofters, and land managers in delivering nature restoration and addressing the twin challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. This year, all eligible applications to AECS were approved, which is record approval rate. This shows that despite significant financial pressures, farmers and land managers will recognize the very real need to mitigate against both nature loss and climate change. I would strongly encourage farmers and crofters to apply for the expanded range of options that the scheme supports now, she further went on to say. William, passing over to you. How impactful do you think an investment like this is for farmers?
Well, it doesn't. It does have a good effect, and I think currently 20% of farming land in Scotland is managed under the scheme that we're talking about, which has been going on now for I think 9 years thus far, and it'll be 10 years with the next rollout that people are being advised to apply for. The sums of money are still relatively small because that's all the money there is under the financial constraints that the Scottish Government endures. I'll use that verb because I think it's appropriate. That's probably the best that can be done. But it's a good and innovative use of the resources they've got. And I would say, just think what we could do with the proper financial levers, because sustainable farming is going to be a big, big question over the next 30 years. And just transforming the way we do things and making sure that we have an environment that we can continue to use. So, yeah, it's very good as it goes. I do wish there was more, but it's an overwhelmingly, I think, good thing that does have an effect.
It is also a sector that has been hurting with weather conditions of late, especially with a lot of the storms.
Very much so.
For our next story, the Scottish Government will help with council tax debt. The Scottish Government is providing extra help for people struggling with council tax debt and will be on offer in free local authority areas under a pilot scheme. Citizens Advice Scotland will receive £200,000 of funding to better understand the reasons why some people end up in council tax arrears and to work collaboratively with local councils to help reduce and prevent council tax debt in future. Citizens Advice Bureau in Renfrewshire, Clackhermannshire, and Scottish Borders will test different ways of working included. Clackmannanshire. It actually wasn't as hard as I gave it credit for in my mind at first. Providing targeted, the kind of supports that they're looking for is providing targeted support to individuals facing council tax debt, simplifying the referrals processes between councils and advice services, organizing mutual training sessions for council and citizens advice staff. Housing Minister Paul McLennan visited Roxburgh and Berwickshire Citizens Advice Bureau to launch the project. Mr. McLennan said, "We know many people are struggling in the cost of living crisis, and that is why we are targeting resources at those most in need. Council tax debt is a significant issue and one that particularly affects the most vulnerable. The free bureaus involved. The three bureaus involved in the pilots have established relationships with their local authorities. This funding will help build on those connections to help individuals tackle problem debt and also provide valuable learning on how public sector debt can best be managed." William, talk to me about the impact of this kind of thing.
Well, council tax debt, I think the Citizens Advice Bureau would say, is the single biggest issue they face in the current cost of living crisis. So anything that can in some way alleviate it, and it really isn't able to do anything about the debt, but it is able to do with how it's addressed, both by the people owing the money, but also by the councils via the advice, Citizens Advice and Give. I think any advance on that is a good thing, just making things flow a bit more freely. It's a pilot scheme for the moment, so it's very important that it's applied well and that the lessons are learned to see if it really is worth a bigger investment. Because, of course, every investment the Scottish Government makes has to be judged against the other demands that their limited budget
Sure.
has.
Do you know
And
how
so
long?
it's important.
Do you know how
Sorry,
long
you were
pilot
saying.
schemes like this usually run for? Before we decide whether they're effective or not?
I don't know if there's a general running time, but I would think that a year would be a decent length of time, because that goes through, if you like, a household's entire budgetary experience, including perhaps raised energy costs in the cold days and that sort of thing. So a year would be reasonable.
That makes sense. Thank you. For our next story, a new Scottish Government Health Secretary meets with frontline staff. The new Scottish Government Health Secretary, Neil Gray, visited Queen Elizabeth's University Hospital in Glasgow today to meet staff working to ensure patients get access to the right treatment as quickly as possible. In his first visit as Health Secretary, Mr. Gray met frontline staff in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde's Flow Navigation Centre, FNC, a virtual A&E service which directs people to the most appropriate care and helps patient flow throughout hospital wards. Figures published by NHS GGC show that of 20,000 calls put through the virtual service last year, only 16% actually required referral to a physical A&E. The remainder were given appointments at minor injuries units, referred to other services, or given advice that meant they did not need to attend hospital. Mr. Gray also visited the hospital's major traumas unit, one of the 4 units throughout Scotland. Mr. Gray said the following: "I was pleased to meet staff working in the Flow Navigation Centre and see firsthand how work is progressing with the hospital's virtual A&E. The services plays a crucial role in directing people to the most appropriate care and is one of the ways the NHS is modernising to meet the needs of the people of Scotland. By preventing unnecessary physical A&E attendances, patients can be better dealt with by other parts of the health service. I am clear that we need to see reform and innovation right across the health service, and NHS GGC's FNC is a perfect example of how we can improve productivity and also improve patient outcomes. William, are you how do you feel about the incorporation of more technology and just having reform in how we treat these health-related issues?
Well, I think, again, we keep coming back to limited budgets. And to me, the Scottish NHS is excellent at working with limited budgets by becoming agile and finding ways round the financial constraints to an extent. And so the investment in a virtual A&E saves money in that it doesn't mean that patients are turning up at the door and causing waiting times to be longer, and indeed the overall expenditure as you find the right place for them to be more. So it's a way of streamlining things that I think has the potential to be really, really effective. And it's very typical of the way that the Scottish NHS tends to react to the constraints by finding an innovative way to deal with them. So I'm very impressed with what I've read about it today. And I think it's probably significant that Neil Gray will be interested in. It's the sort of service that he would want to see as he makes his way into the job of health secretary, where I think he has probably the likelihood that he will do a very good job based on his performance in other areas so far. So for me, it's a good news story.
Thank you so much for that, William. And also, thank you for joining me today as we will be wrapping up, as that is it for this evening. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programs will be always free to view. However, if you can afford the £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are now just under £1,000 short of our £10,000 target. Although the pressure has been eased, we will still need to raise at the last £1,000 to pay our bills immediately, so we can then focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. Thanks again to our guest, William Duguid. You can find him on social media and on his blog. And goodbye, and thank you for watching.